So this is Black Kids in Outer Space, and we have an exciting panel today. What we're going to have is we're going to have three people in urban planning, and I'm really excited. We have Enjoleah Daye. He's a transportation planner and transit equity and bicycle enthusiast with 8 years of diverse experience in corridor planning, NEPA analysis, transportation demand management, and technical writing. And she's a Rutgers grad. We also have Thalya Reyes, and she's a candidate for dual master's in public policy and city and regional planning from the Bloustein School at Rutgers University. She's also studied economics at Michigan State. Reyes has researched a variety of issues related to economic well-being, environmental justice, and regional development, including the impacts of climate change on public transportation, infrastructure, policy, place-based child-focused poverty eradication programs, and public school education. We also have Jasmine Jones-Burns. Is a graduate and senior at the Edwards J. Bloustein School of Planning and Public Policy at Rutgers University. She's passionate about health, equity, environmental justice, and economic development. Jasmine was born and raised in Piscataway, New Jersey. Sorry if I'm pronouncing some of those things wrong. She hopes to use her career in planning to strengthen and improve the quality of life of minority and low-income communities. But first we have Reyes, which thank you so much. You know, it's like funny, I found her on social media, and I was like, she's so interesting in regards to all the things that she was saying. And so I was like, okay, you have to be on the show. She's like, what? I'm like, you're important. You got to be on the show. And, you know, I would kind of like to start this conversation with a really interesting thing I found from a place called Urban Design. And it says, urban planning without social equity is like playing chess without the queen. And so it's kind of like, oh, wow, you know, we are, hold on 1 second right here. Sorry about that. So what we're trying to do is trying to figure out, like, you know, how can we make urban planning more equitable? How can we make urban planning something that, you know, is something we can all participate in? So I'm going to actually start with Reyes. So can you kind of let me know about what you kind of think about urban planning and social justice, and how can we make that something that's more part of planning?
Hi, Lark. So you could call me by my first name, Thalya.
Okay.
So in terms of social justice and urban planning, I very much agree with that saying. I think that those issues of social justice are integral to equitable urban planning. But when we look at the history of urban planning, we see that planning and zoning have been used in ways to segregate, to marginalize particular groups of people, to oppress certain groups of people through the way that we codify land around us and how we use the land around us, especially in Black and Brown communities. So moving forward, that history needs to be examined, and we need to really acknowledge that past so that we can have a brighter future, more equitable future.
Yes. I mean, I think that that's something that's really, really important, because I think a lot of times when we see things in regards to urban planning, it's through the lens of kind of like the urban planners and not so much as like with the people. So we're really trying to kind of like with this conversation, we are trying to figure out how can we become more equitable. I know that you have a lot of focus, well, not a lot, but you have experience in regards to environmental justice and how that impacts people. I know that you know about the southern part of New Jersey, correct?
Yeah, I'm from North Jersey, and I went to undergrad in South Jersey at Rowan University.
Okay, so I guess one thing I know is that I saw information about the Delaware River and how DuPont has done a lot in regards to polluting the river. And also, too, Camden is has a large Black population, and it's apparently it's lower in it's like low, so it floods and things like that. So how does that impact, you know, in regards to urban planning? Like, how should people be thinking in regards to that? Should we be thinking about economics? Should we be thinking about environmental justice? It seems like sometimes environmental justice is not something that's brought up.
Yeah, and all those issues are very much interrelated: economics, social issues, ways in which health. Though those all fall under the environmental justice considerations.
Mm-hmm.
When you think about a community like Camden, which is majority African American, Afro Latinx, you have many people who are not English speaking dominant. You have a huge immigrant population. When we look at the issues in Camden, it's a history of this community bearing the brunt of environmental burdens for the county and for the region. Incinerators, different cement plants being put up in the area that has a negative impact on air quality, that has a detrimental impact on water and water quality. So issues, and like you had mentioned, it's in a floodplain. So when there are storm events, that the Camden community ends up getting a lot of that water from the river and from the tributaries of the Delaware, flooding into the streets of the community, and that exposes them to a number of public health concerns. This is true of my hometown as well. I'm from Passaic, New Jersey, which is a small post-industrial city, former mill town in northern New Jersey. They also are impacted by many of these same issues, have similar demographics. So you see this time and time again in New Jersey, as well as in a number of other states.
No, I mean, this is something that I've noticed, like living, being from the West Coast, coming to the East Coast, but then going to the Midwest and seeing the same issues over and over again in regards to not just urban planning, but urban planning is part of environmental justice. And seeing, time and time again, we seem to see where communities of color, Black and Latinx communities, especially in urban communities, they are somehow left out of the urban planning part. I mean, you're in school for urban planning, but you've been around, you've been doing a lot of things. Why do you think that is the case? I mean, I know it's kind of a big question, but why do you think this is kind of like, and it's not like a New Jersey thing, or it happened in California, it happens everywhere.
Yes, absolutely. So one of the things that I learned in undergrad, where I had a little bit of a planning focus in my environmental studies and geography program, but then even more so during urban planning studies and just working in the community as an AmeriCorps service member, you learn about like levels of participation and involvement, especially particularly when it comes to the planning process. Many times we see ways in which the community is engaged in the planning process to be either kind of more manipulation, more on like the bottom rung of what is called the citizen participation ladder, or ladder of citizen participation, where it's not really active participation. It's more non-participation, manipulation, and therapy on that sense. You eventually see more communities, more planners involving community members in a little bit more actively, but they ultimately end up tokenizing the community. They're just consulting them, informing them of a project that's being done, but not necessarily giving them active control of how the project ends up looking. And that's something that I think planners really need to strive towards if we're really going to be representative of meeting the material needs of Black and Brown people in the communities in which we plan. And so this kind of technocratic power dynamic where the planners are the ones making the decisions, but the people in the community who live and you know experience the impact of these plans and the implementation of these plans aren't readily involved. That needs to stop for us to be able to equitably plan these communities.
I mean, I think that's something that in Los Angeles, I remember distinctively going to one of these events where I saw, it was like this idea that, the community was there and then they said, what you guys want is a condo, the LA River. And they're like, you guys want condos. And the community was like, no, I don't want condos. But then the planners, and I don't know if they were the planners, the policymakers were like, no, you don't want a soccer field. What you want is a condo. And I was really kind of shocked. And I have to say, hello, Daye, how are you? We brought you onto the channel. And so what we're talking about now is how can we get authentic planning during the planning process? Because a lot of times, we kind of think like, oh yeah, we're letting people have choice for doing community outreach, but it seems like as Reyes said, she's like, what's happening is consulting, kind of like we want to say that we hear you, but yet we don't really want to hear you. So, any comments on that, Daye?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think that I got involved in the planning process on both sides from the beginning, and then on the other side with respects to sort of project delivery. But you're absolutely right. I think one of the things that's missing is a lot of Black and Brown voices early on in the process. Mm-hmm. And that I can definitely attest to that, particularly in Newark, New Jersey, where, projects go up. There's sort of an open house. They encourage, community voices to come out. But the thing is that, the aftermath of that, what planners don't really realize is that there's, I think, sometimes a sense of unsurety about if my voice is going to be heard or what is this about. So there's, I think, a disconnect oftentimes between these sort of broad, grandiose planning projects and between the residents on the ground. And oftentimes, I think one of the projects that I worked on last was that a lot of immigrants were just afraid to come out. When you talk about and I think that's respected to, status. Oftentimes you come out, you really don't know what's going on. You have engineers, planners, stakeholders talking at you. And I just think there's a big disconnect in terms of the community, oftentimes in the public planning process. But also it also starts at the top. And I think that, we're starting to see a shift where agencies, consulting firms are really pushing towards, having a diverse sort of makeup of having a team, a planning team in particular, mirror the communities that you're planning to an extent.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that's one thing I've noticed too, is that when I go to different planning events, I don't know if we are always kind of in the position of power to decide things. It seems like a lot of times people of color, Latinx people, African American people, our job is to tell the community what people who are the business people, who are predominantly middle class, white male, your job is to tell them that they want what we want. I mean, is that like something that's common, or am I reading that wrong?
I'm like sort of a renegade planner. I'm the one that is, I'm always in trouble because I think that it's not for us to tell them what they want. It's for us to listen and to see what's most important in their communities. I mean, think about how many times I've walked around cities and there was something that was seemed really cool, but was so underutilized. And it's because we put what we thought, met the standards in terms of urban design, or now a new uptick in trends of gentrification. I mean, oftentimes there's so many bike infrastructure in particular that goes unused because they just didn't plan it out right. And so I think if they would have sort of really engaged with the community and asked them what they want and where they wanted it, we wouldn't have so much sort of underutilized, in my opinion, infrastructure.
Well, let's go back to Camden, South New Jersey. I know that they're actually started tomorrow. They're actually going to start a bike share.
Right.
And I was kind of looking at the map, and I was like, "Does this map look like?" I mean, did any of you get a chance to check out the map? Let me look and see if I can actually find the map here. This is if you guys can see it. Can you guys see that, or is it too small?
No, I can see it.
Yeah.
Like this is where the, I guess the thing is that it's dockless. So dockless is this wonderful thing where if it's dockless, we can all access it. So, when you look at that map, does that seem like it's where, I know that 48% of Camden is African American, Black. Does that look like something that they can access? I don't want to put you on the spot because I just found that map like today. And is this, because I know the docked bike share was very kind of like, people were like, it's never in our community. Like in Brooklyn, it was not in our community. But docked is supposed to be more equitable. I mean, what are your guys' opinions on that?
I mean, so it's interesting. I am a recent West Coast transplant, and I see it everywhere. And a part of me, I guess, sort of that has not shaken off that East Coast edge yet. Yeah. I think that while it definitely opens the gates when it comes to equity.
Yes.
But I think it's not really meant to be in every city or every place. Okay. Even here, I'm seeing dockless bikes that are just totally trashed, and they're upside down in garbage cans. Now that doesn't mean that I don't think it can work, in a lot of places. I definitely think Camden would be a good sort of pilot run. Yeah. And especially given the transit down there. So if they can make it a way so that it could sort of seamlessly, you can connect with Patco, the New Jersey Transit line going from Trenton, and then that kicks up from that other part of the South Jersey going into Philadelphia, and with the bike share, I think when we start thinking about something like that, regionalism is sort of a good thing. But I'm all for it. I just don't think that it could be successful in every single city, if that makes sense.
Okay.
Absolutely. And one of the, especially with the dockless bikes, we're seeing a lot of issues. One city that comes to mind is Dallas, where there are a number of private dockless operators in the city. Dallas already isn't a very bikeable city, but yet you have several dockless bike share operators, bikes everywhere, bikes being vandalized. This is partly because the community wasn't involved in this decision making. And so that's something that, again, we really need to stop making decisions for the community just because we think that with our fancy degrees or with whatever expertise or, clout that we think that we have, to be able to do something so widespread, altering of how a community looks without their input it's rude, to say the least. One thing with the Camden bike share, and this is kind of like my general criticism of how bike shares are currently being rolled out, is that more times than not, these are private operators or private equipment providers. And so when we talk about bike share systems, that's something that I absolutely feel like should be in more communities. we should definitely be planning for more active transportation methods and routes within communities. But the way that it's currently being used, or rather the current paradigm in bike share systems, is predominantly in the domain of private corporations coming in. And in that sense, it's kind of like these bikes are taking up public space, right? And so what does that mean when we have a private operator or a private equipment provider coming in with their equipment, whether or not they've gotten permission from the mayor's office and from the planning board to be able to operate within the city. But to ultimately have this be kind of an occupation of public space without direct public involvement, regular, meaningful direct public involvement, to me seems like these kinds of bike share systems, private bike share systems, will continue to run into some hurdles unless we change the way in which we implement these plans. I know there's been some community involvement with the Camden Bike Share project, but it definitely needs to be stepped up in the coming weeks and months for as long as the bike share pilot is going on. I believe until the end of December or so.
Well, that's what you guys were talking about, the authentic engagement. This kind of engagement that's more than just, I call it the gap engagement. Where it's kind of like, well, we've got some Black people and some Latino people, and there you go. And they're on a bike, and here's a picture. You're like, oh, well, you actually talk to the people who live there, not just get the pictures. Okay, let's go back up. We're like driving back up and forth down New Jersey. We're going to go back north to New Jersey, and we're going to go to, Newark has some real issues in regards to labor. And we're in this kind of like, oh, we want Amazon, but I don't know if I want Amazon because you have to go to the bathroom in a cup or something. I mean, you can't I shouldn't use that analogy, but with the labor market, how is New Jersey? In New Jersey? How are we going to become a place where people work instead of a place where people kind of stay until they go to New York? I know that, the gig economy, the Lyfts, the Airbnbs, the Uber, the Amazons. I mean, what do you guys think about labor, involved in all this urban planning? Reyes, who would like to first? Who'd like to jump in?
So I have very strong feelings about the gigs, quote unquote, sharing economy. That I'll start with Amazon at least. The Economic Policy Institute recently released a report showing how little of an economic impact and an employment impact these Amazon distribution centers are having in communities. And New Jersey is kind of like a hotbed of this kind of development. And I know that HQ2 will look slightly different than just like a standard distribution center. But to think about the amount of money being put towards tax breaks for Amazon when we have no evidence that they return the economic impact for that investment to the communities in which they are hosted in, it seems irresponsible, to say the least, to say that we should be funding these tax incentives for Amazon for a quote unquote promise of jobs, which it ultimately ends up not being fulfilled. Mm-hmm. As far as Airbnb, Uber, and Lyft, all of these are huge issues when we think about how folks need to give up their personal possessions. They need to basically lease out their personal possessions so that they can go and be able to make a little bit more money in a still struggling New Jersey economy. Mm-hmm. When, in considering ways to get around this, obviously on the Uber Lyft side, We need to improve public transportation infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
Recent studies have shown that Uber and Lyft are not replacing car trips, they're replacing public transit trips. And so we're not even reducing greenhouse gas emissions, we're not reducing vehicle miles traveled, we're making the problem a lot worse. And there are only pockets of New Jersey that are really, really transit accessible, bike friendly, pedestrian friendly, and for us to like exacerbate that problem with trying to bring more of those kinds of corporations or give those corporations tax incentives or anything to build in the community or to reside their businesses, you know, quote unquote, because with Airbnb and these kind of sharing economy corporations, they don't own the brick and mortar. They're just providing an app for the most part.
Well, I mean, I think that's one of the things too that I find
it's a struggle.
I find it easier to get to Manhattan than it is for me to get around New Jersey.
Indeed.
So
Mm-hmm.
for especially for Black and Latinx communities that are that maybe don't have those jobs in New York, that are maybe trying to get around New Jersey, it's almost impossible. And I remember going to Newark to the Black part, the more predominantly African American section of Newark, and it was going to take me an hour and a half to get there by bus. I mean, and I'm just like, it takes me 40 minutes to get to Manhattan. But I'm in Halcyon Park. I'm in Bloomfield. It doesn't, to me, it's just outrageous. But right now I'm gonna go to the GIS. I know people, and this is kind of a weird thing. You know, we have technology, we have policy, and we have economics. I know that, you know, GIS has become really popular in urban planning and kind of like monitoring things and monitoring equity conditions with regards to placement. I mean, are people using those to actually help people, or they're just using it for economics? I mean, within urban planning, how is that working? That's kind of a big question.
Well, I think that on two sides, I think that, so I graduated from Bloustein as well many years ago. Mm-hmm. And I find that it depends on your, where you are. It depends on the agency. It depends on the consultant firm of which you work. I mean, luckily I have worked at firms where they had a really good sort of GIS directory and they were quite the powerhouse. Same thing at the public sector. Now I can only speak to the GIS that I'm being introduced here in Washington State. And what I tell you, I am quite impressed. While I would say sort of the priority here, and just given the land use, is more on the environmental side. Mm-hmm. To have something built like that's being used by biologists, hydrologists, planners, engineers to make informed planning decisions about a potential project, obviously before it becomes shovel ready. But at this stage that's most important, that NEPA stage, I think it's very beneficial. It just depends on how you use it. But I tell my friends, like, they think I'm a GIS nerd. You can map anything. You can map bus shelters. You can map, bike racks. You can map the homeless. So I think it's a powerful tool that I really would like to see sort of a bigger push to utilizing it. Definitely in public sector and that sort of a state agency level.
No, I would love to be able to kind of, just put in numbers and like when somebody goes, we want to bring this to our place, or we want to bring, Amazon, and put some numbers in and go, this is many jobs, this is many people who have this kind of degree in order to get these jobs, and this is how the impact, or this is how much pollution is going to cause. I mean, we have technology. And then what about policy? I mean, do you think policy can actually, like when we're doing urban planning, we kind of go, okay, there should be a policy that states if you build this, then you need to make sure you have this amount of affordable housing or this amount of people that have jobs. But even affordable housing, that means something so different to so many,
Absolutely.
Like you got to make $100,000 a year. So you think like, oh, I'm being fair. But what do you guys think about policies? Any policies, ideas, or anything like that?
Absolutely. We have, on the GIS side, we know that we can also use this on the community level as well. There's open source geographic information systems as well. You can go into Google My Maps and create your own community mapping project if you really wanted to as well. I know that there are a number of nonprofits and community-based organizations that are doing that kind of community-based mapping, paper maps. This is all stuff that we can really integrate with each other with each other on the policy level. These are the ways in which we institutionalize these practices. So whether it's a organizational policy to be able to say, these are the kind of projects that we're going to work on. These are the projects we're going to fund. Say if you're a community development financial institution and you're doing affordable housing, as you say, that depending on what metric affordability, that can be a point of contention. This can be ways in which we organize ourselves. And then on the local, state, and even federal level, when we're thinking about ways in which to equitably develop our communities. There are systems that we have in place that right now don't work in favor of poor Black and brown people in our communities, people of other marginalized voices as well, people with disabilities, people who are rather English language learners, ways in which the land around us is used that ends up disempowering a lot of folks. But we know that it's policy is one end, but we also need to do the good work of organizing from the ground up as well. And that's kind of what's missing in the credo of a lot of planners, is that a lot of folks end up viewing their work as very technocratic, as very technical work, and forget to do the basic work of engaging people from the bottom up and empowering them. Because our role as planners is not to, as Enjoleah said, not to dictate what the community wants, but rather to hear them out, hear what their needs are, and then work with them to actualize that vision.
Yeah, I know. And one of the challenges is that I think some people feel that you're being too political when you are being a social, when you're thinking about the human being part of it. But it's kind of like, if you are thinking about the human being part of it, aren't you being political in another way? I mean, I'm gonna bring up one. I remember at one point in Los Angeles, they wanted to bring a stadium, which they did finally bring. And in order to bring the stadium, they had to do an EIR, an environmental impact report. Right. And what they did was they went around and kind of funded this AstroTurf group who went around, got signatures, kind of like, oh, we had a policy to make sure this doesn't happen, and it didn't matter. It didn't work. Like you said, we need people on the ground. We need policy, but we need people to follow the policy when it has to do with communities of color. Because it seems like when it's communities of color, all of a sudden they forget the policy. I mean, if that's, and it's something I've seen over and over and over again. So, I mean, what are, I want you each to tell me like an area or a city or a town, anywhere that kind of working. To kind of is there a place that's kind of working? And the thing is that, to me, it has to be working for Black people, for Latinx people, for Indigenous people. It has to be working for everybody, not just because I know people will bring up a place that's like, there are no Black people there. There are no Black people there. Yeah, it's working, but what's a place that's working that we live at?
That's difficult. Okay. I'm going to give two examples.
Okay.
My previous town, Montclair.
Okay.
Diverse-ish.
Yeah.
I think the scale of it makes it work.
Okay.
So that can't be replicated in Irvington. Only because it's not because of drive, not because the people don't want it. So that's a good example of But then also that's definitely, I mean, New Jersey is quite unique in the sense that it has backing its policy local influence. You know, there are things that various municipalities can do that the state can't even pull off, you know? So, but I would say Montclair is a nice sort of walkable, pedestrian friendly, transit oriented, bikeable place. And I think that's because of, with respect to transportation, sort of you have the diverse mix, and sort of through the starting with sort of local policy and ordinances and pushing through to complete a plan. So that product, that tangible sort of infrastructure that you see. Now, I think when it comes to housing development, they have a long way to go. I sat on the town zoning board for for close to 3 years, and they're still very much rigid in the sense of what they will allow and won't allow in terms of both residential and commercial development. So, but in terms of your basic kind of walkable, trying to transit on a replicable scale, I think the Montclair. Secondly, I lived in DC. They have a combination of just will, guts, and policy, just to kind of do stuff that I've never even, seen before. I mean, it blew my mind with the whole slug line and slugging. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that term. Slugging is basically ad hoc carpooling. It is, it's not regulated by anyone. It's simply, you imagine park and rides that have lines of people that just basically, they need that third body to get on that HOV lane. And so they'll just hold up a sign or shout out a destination. And that's the one thing where time is really trumping money. But the magnitude of slug lines, because it's not governed by by the city, it's quite unique in that sense. Because being from North New Jersey and in the New York area, I'm like, well, how do you know this person doesn't have a warrant? How do you know? You're asking all sorts of questions, but it's regulated. There has not been an issue to date, and I must say it's quite fascinating. But those are my two examples, Montclair and DC.
Do you have any examples, or I mean, some people you might not have one.
Yeah, I mean, we across the United States, we have a long way to go. I will highlight my future hometown area, or rather my future home in the coming months, the Twin Cities in Minnesota, as like an area that is doing a lot in terms of engaging community and in a meaningful way. Community leading a lot of projects in transit development, in affordable housing development, equitable housing, thinking about health in all our policies. But there's still a lot of, issues. Buses don't, North Minneapolis, where most of the community is African American, is not as readily served by the bus lines as the suburban core is. So in that respect, there's in addition to that, there's like a significant number of affordable housing units have been lost over the last 15 years. So there's still issues there. I'm really inspired by what's going on in Jackson, Mississippi right now with Mayor Chokwe Antar Lamumba and Cooperation Jackson and the Jackson Push Plan. There is a lot of excitement around equitably developing the city. It's the largest urban center in the state, of course. And I think when you think about food justice, they're doing a lot of work in community gardening and engaging folks in economic development strategies. That's really cool. you look abroad, and I think of La Paz, Bolivia, like right off the top of my head. A little bit different in terms of geography. They rely on those kind of like sky gondolas to get a lot of people to get folks from place to place. But I think thinking about the large indigenous and Afro-Indigenous population in Bolivia, having a president who is actively involved and engaged in empowering the people from the bottom up. I think that there's a lot of hope and a lot of great communities out there that we can model and make unique, specific to communities here in the States and in New Jersey specifically, right? Because a lot of these projects need to be very place-based, place conscious at least, so that we're not necessarily applying a cookie cutter approach to all our transit, housing, economic, et cetera, developments.
Shout out to Oakland too. Oakland is another
Ooh.
one comes to mind, with just policy around housing, kind of this holistic, just movement. I think it's because, most importantly, the folks that are driving the narrative around transit equity, affordable housing, are Black and Brown people. And so, I'm seeing some really interesting things. And now that their transportation agency is sort of now a freestanding kind of DOT, OCDOT, I'm looking for them and expecting some interesting things in the future.
Okay. No, but I mean, I thank you guys for coming down. I know it was a quick, we're going to talk about everything. We're going to fix it. Definitely fix it, but we will, we'll know what we should be bringing to lunch on our journey to fix it, because this is going to be a long journey, but I have faith that it can get done, and we can actually have cities that everybody can work and live and thrive in. But thank you guys so much for sitting down and talking with me today in Black Kids in Outer Space, in our first kind of like talk show panel type thing. So thank you so much. And thank you all of those who sat and watched. We appreciate you guys. Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Thank you for having us. Bye.
Thank you. Have a good night. Power to the people.
Yes. Yes.
Wakanda forever.
Yes.
Black kids in outer space. Black kids in outer space. Black kids in outer space. Urban planning, walking, bicycling, and more in our space.